Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Safron Rossi, and we're doing part 2 of our conversation. And that is mainly because we were cut off midstream last time because of an internet outage. So welcome, Safron.
Hi, John.
And Safron, I'm going to just do a little mini backyard recap of our last conversation. And if I say anything wrong, you can just yell at me from over there or something like that. But it seemed to me that you grew up in New York and your parents were quite open, cosmopolitan New York, and they were open to spirituality and the spirit of the times, let's say. And you got involved in myth, let's say. This is just how I interpreted our conversation. You got involved in myth through reading Joseph Campbell, perhaps initially, and The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And I always think that's a little bit significant from the start, like that entry point, and I know for me it was through reading Hillman, The Myth of Analysis, but it's kind of like, it says something, doesn't it? That book that brought you in, or that entree into myth and Jung and all of that. And then you found your way to Pacifica Graduate Institute, and we were talking about. We began to talk about the Odyssey and the Iliad, and the Iliad was about war, and it was a little bit about, it seemed to me, the masculine as conquest, and you were saying that in Joseph Campbell's idea that somehow the Odyssey was a corrective, if I could use that word, or somehow maybe an enantiodromia, could use that word. It's kind of like on the other side. It's like with Odysseus, we have the hero, but he's a different kind of hero. He's kind of like following the soul. He has to go to all those different islands to have different kinds of experiences. He's learning different kinds of things. He's kind of being initiated into the feminine aspect more, it seems.
Right. Well, and just in terms of like characterizing the Iliad, I wouldn't say that it's just about conquest, although obviously Helen of Troy as the object that is the center of all of this battle does suggest that as being a theme. But I would say in a more general sense that the Iliad is an epic poem about the warrior and the different kinds of the warriors and the challenges and creativity and themes that belong to the warrior. And I think you're right. I like the idea of the Odyssey as a kind of enantiodromia or something of the other side, because Odysseus is not a warrior. I mean, if we remember how he was roped into going to Troy, he tried to get out of it. He tried to pretend that he was insane.
Yeah.
So Odysseus isn't a warrior by nature. So isn't that interesting that the Odyssey is centered around a figure who was basically conscripted to war?
Yeah.
And is trying to get back home.
Yeah.
So Campbell's approach to it, which is, for people listening that are interested in, really being able to dig into this is in the Campbell book that I edited of his goddess lectures that were in his archival manuscript collection. It's one of the chapters in that book. And so people can really get a sense of Campbell's beautiful way of looking at different scenes. But his whole approach is, well, what if the Odyssey is a kind of story that's describing what has to happen in order for there to be a return to a right relationship to the feminine after such a marked period of being within the sort of masculine mode.
Yeah.
Now, in mythic terms, war is the perfect kind of field by which to imagine that. But I think in our lived life, this isn't just applicable to military people, although obviously they too have a very kind of concrete, experiences in that way. But I think any time that we have spent significant energy and time in our masculine mode of pursuit of some accomplishment, forward drive in order to create something, whether that's writing or building a house or teaching or whatever that might be, that there needs to be, if we think about our lives as being about the development of a kind of wholeness, that there needs to be some movement toward the feminine. And I think this is even more marked in our age, where consciousness itself, and definitely our Western cultures that some of us belong to, value the masculine over the feminine. We value doing and active pursuit, yeah, and conquest of daily life. So for Campbell, the Odyssey is an epic work looking at what is feminine initiation. Like, what does that look like? And so with Calypso, who, as I mentioned in the first part of our conversation, as being a kind of avatar for Hera, like, Odysseus is with her for 7 years on her island. So, I mean, that goes into like, relationship. Like, how do we live with another in partnership, compromise and negotiation and sharing space and all of that? But really at the core of it with Calypso is this whole idea of eros and the relational pull toward another, which in traditional terms belongs to the field of the feminine, which is about union, the way beings come together. The masculine is about differentiation, the way we can sort of separate things in order to get a sense of how things work. But the feminine is about union. It's about closeness. It's about eros. So so that's Campbell's just really, I think, deeply creative and kind of redemptive in a way view of the Odyssey. And all of it, sorry, let me just say this last thing and see what strikes you, is that all of it in the drama of the story is in service to Odysseus returning home to Penelope, like ready to be back with her, so that he's not just like fresh off the battlefield and kind of crazy or whatever, basically uninitiated into home life.
Yeah.
And there's something really beautiful about that, this idea that to be reunited with his wife and partner, like he has to go through a whole other series of trials to be ready for that, to be present to her. And I think that's really interesting, how we might reflect on that in our own lived experience. How do we 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the evening, for those of us that work, just kind of expect to kind of shift into being attentive to our partners or to our own creative life or to deep rest? I mean, it's like there's transition, isn't there? Like we can't just go from one world into another. And so in a really sort of mundane way, the Odyssey describes something of the process of moving between worlds and the due attention maybe that requires, the patience that requires. So those are just some thoughts, but
some of the things I think of, and this has been said many times before, is kind of like that journey towards wholeness in the Odyssey, which is another word that we could use, or right relationship to the feminine, as you said. And it's like a, I don't know, the conjunctio in a way. It's like, but I would relate it back also to something that James Hillman said, that, you know, when Jung was talking about first half of life, second half of life, it's often that, and I think this is a little of what you were saying, in the first half of life, there's that perhaps ambition or some of those ego ideals or masculine development taking one's place in the world. And then, but I think Hillman's point was that in the second half of life, it's almost like he was talking about the initiation through the feminine for men, or whatever. It's like that is the mystery, the transformative mystery towards wholeness, or
right. Right. And in classical Jungian terms, the first half of life, what are we doing? We're developing a strong ego. And the ego, to use archetypal astrological language, that's the sun. The solar principle is symbolically masculine because it moves forward. It's action oriented. It's about progress. It's about doing. But that at the sort of noon point, the midpoint of life, it's as if that solar ego development, the heroic ascent, we could say, reaches its fullness. And then comes the second half of life, quote unquote, which would be the death of the heroic ego as we've known it.
Yeah.
And the coming into a relationship with, or an initiation to, the unconscious, and the self as the capital S, the inner divinity, or we could talk about it as the feminine, the anima. I mean, there are many sort of synonyms that we can use in-depth language, but yes, it is about, you know, it's a huge shift in terms of our sense of identity and like what we're doing and what it's about, and where is our allegiance? Is our allegiance to the heroic ego, or is it to something much deeper and mysterious, like you said? And so, yeah, I mean, we could maybe look at the Iliad and the Odyssey as maybe giving us insights into those dimensions, which is a nice idea.
Happen along the way. And I remember reading a book a long, long time ago from Jean Houston, Hero and the Goddess. I don't know whether you've read it, but she said something like, Odysseus is not your normal kind of hero. You know, it's almost like he'd rather a feed than a fight. Whereas in the Iliad, they'd much rather a fight than a feed. Whereas he's in a way, he's trying to escape the trouble. But I think that I heard you say in a talk that one of the ways in which Campbell talked about the hero is that the hero can hear the song of the muses. And I think that's what, you know, that's a good change from the heroic ego that sometimes people talk about, and sometimes James Hillman talks about, you know, Daniel Boone going into the wilderness with his dog and his Bible and conquering the, you know, the wilds or whatever. But then there's this, you know, there's Odysseus, the hero, who starts to hear the song of the muses, perhaps, or something like that.
Right. And I think what you're touching on is that there are different kinds of heroes, and you know, the hero that hears the song of the muses is basically the hero who has willingly sacrificed something of their own egoic sense in order to be connected to the greater or deeper mystery of life.
Yeah.
And all heroes, true heroes, undergo an underworld initiation. So the hero is not just the one that, like, by hook or by crook, like manages to just push through all of the challenges that they find, On some level, they themselves die. And that death is the initiation. That death is the death that allows us to be attuned to the song of the muses. It's the death of the small self and the birth of the greater self, who is then connected to the transpersonal or archetypal depths, we could say, which again, in classical Jungian language would be the self, the capital S self. But, you know, we can just amplify it in those ways. So yeah, but there are different kinds of, yeah, it's a really powerful idea. And Campbell lays this out at the very beginning of The Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he says, the hero is the one who is willing to die, to willingly sacrifice the small self for the greater self.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's
the twice born idea of myth,
right.
You know, in the sense of
exactly.
There's a death and a rebirth somewhere there in the middle.
That's right.
And it all gets a little bit tricky because you don't know whether that's going to be successful or end in tragedy somewhere.
Right. And Campbell talks about that we have our first birth, which is being born to our biological mother, being born into the world as it is. And then our second birth is a spiritual birth.
Yeah.
And it has to do with a change in consciousness. Yeah.
And so, Safron, if Athena is everywhere throughout the Odyssey, tell us a little bit about Athena.
Yeah, I mean, she's a you know, one of the great goddesses of, you know, Greek religion, and one of her sort of domains is that she there are a number of heroes that were like her beloveds. So she was a companion to heroes. And I think that has to do with the way Athena values civilization, like civilization as in the creating of spaces where life can be attended and culture can take root and blossom. And at their most creative, that's what heroes do. That I mean, if we think about Campbell's outline of the hero's journey, you know, after all of the crazy, intense conflict and battles and night sea journey and death and rebirth, the hero returns from the journey she or he has been on, returns to the world, returns to the community that they had to leave behind, and brings the elixir, the treasure, the thing that they found on their journey. I mean, so if we listen into that, they bring something of deep value back to culture, back to the civilization. And so Athena, because of that, we can see the sense of her connection to heroes, because she is a goddess for whom, I mean, if we look at the things that she was said to have invented and given humankind, she plants the first olive tree, olives, as a source of, sorry?
Thank goodness for that.
Right. Source of oil and food and lamplight and cooking oil and shade. I mean, everything. She's said to have invented the bridle so that horses could be tamed, the art of weaving so that fabric could, I mean, so her arts are the arts of culture and civilization. So she's deeply connected to the creative side of the hero in that way. Yeah.
So, you know, I think sometimes I just want to float this out there for a while. Sometimes when people talk about civilizing, I'm thinking about the present time now, you know, our present environment a little, is people have strong views about what that civilizing influence is, you know, like what the good is. for our community or whatever. But I think one thing I'd add is even if you take a Campbell and a Hillman, that what sometimes people come back with into their community, it's so markedly different. It's so unique. And it's not a standardized civilization. You know what I mean? It's like it comes from that daemon of that person, or that treasure that's brought back is a unique contribution in some way.
Right.
Do you know what I'm trying to get at there? Because I think sometimes when people talk about adding to the good, they often have political views about that very strongly, whereas I would see it as something a little bit different.
Well, I think when we look at Athena as personifying a certain archetypal worldview, and this is something that Hillman has written about, that Athena is invested in the norm. Athena personifies the forces of collectivity that are moving in their optimal flow and harmony.
Yeah.
So it's about standards. It's about the norm, the rules, the laws that kind of work for most. And because it works for most, it sort of keeps the roiling messiness of individual lives connected in some way, in the polis. I mean, political comes from the Greek polis, which just means the collective. So I do think that there's something about Athena that sanctifies a certain homogeneity, and the way that that's necessary for a certain kind of peace. And that's neither right nor wrong. I would just say that Athena personifies that principle.
But didn't you say somewhere else though that Athena was known for her wit and her well, that Metis is the word.
Well,
I don't know.
right. Well, her mother is Metis, who is like embodied wisdom. But in the Odyssey, Athena says that one of the reasons why she loves Odysseus, or that, that he's one of her sort of cherished heroes, is because of how clever he is. So she loves his own cleverness and wittiness around things. So there is this delight in the creative dimension of thought, the kind of seeing through things, and that is a part of her as well. Yes. I think it's part of the spirit of invention, like seeing something differently. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about the gods, that they're not one track figures. There are so many facets or valences or dimensions of the psyche that the gods personify. It's not just one thing. I mean, there are certain gods that have a kind of crystallized form to them, where, like, for example, Demeter is so much a mother goddess. And that's very, very clear. And others can have much more kind of protean shape-shifting dimensions, like Persephone and Artemis and Athena. But I think that's important, that we don't flatten the gods. We don't turn them into like one-dimensional descriptions of one thing. They personify the archetypal nature of the world, of life, of nature itself, and so they're polyvalent or multivalent. And very often they contradict themselves. They contain their own paradoxes.
Which is what James Hillman reminds us of often. And interesting that you were curator of through the Opus Archive of two very different people that both spoke a lot about the hero Hillman and Campbell, and Hillman maybe reminds of that polytheism all the time, and the variance perhaps too.
Right. Right. Yeah. And you know, sort of drawing off of his work, the whole idea is that what is archetypal opens us up, whereas what is a stereotype closes it down. Right. So the definition of what is archetypal is that it's as if it's limitless, that we can keep exploring and moving and turning it over. It invokes a sense of depth, whereas a stereotype flattens, puts in a box, you know.
Okay, good. Well, Safron, I wanted to go on to archetypal if we're finished with the Odyssey, unless you've got something
Sure.
you'd like to
No, that's
add.
all right.
It'd be good to go on to archetypal astrology, if we could. But first, if it's okay with you, can we just do our little word association test?
Right.
So
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to throw in a few things here.
Okay.
You've got to tell me the first thoughts that come to your mind.
Okay.
Sorry, I hope you don't think we've gone back to primary school, but let's see. Carl Jung.
Master.
You want to keep on going?
Oh no, I thought it was like one word. Yeah.
No, you can expand a little.
That was all I got.
Okay. Ginette Paris.
Well, she was a professor of mine, an idol, ferociously cool, and just an extraordinary individual.
Rick Tarnas.
Cosmic, expansive, philosophical greatness.
And not fiercely cool? Can we throw that in? No, sorry, that's just...
It's just different. If you've met Ginette and Rick, they're different. He's yeah, I don't know how to...
Yeah, no, that's good.
It's different. Yeah. Yeah.
Thomas More. We're speaking a little bit about the Jung world. Thomas More.
Right. Well, first association, of course, is Ficino. He has that beautiful book on Ficino's astrology or astrological view of the psyche. I think playful. He has a playful sensibility. Yeah.
I often I know I'm butting in this in our little word association test, but I often chuckle at how him and James Hillman are quite philosophically aligned, but they've got such different styles or ways of delivery, and
right.
They're kind of like complementary. I find they're it works well together.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Hillman is the greatest influence on Tom Moore's work, and that's documented in all of his works. I think maybe the sort of difference between them, though, is that Moore has a faith-based background, so he has a more I mean, how do you say, like, and I think Hillman said this at some point too, that Moore, he's almost he's a little bit more like a priest, or there's a kind of service that he's trying to do in terms of nursing people into the archetypal imagination. And Hillman doesn't have that sensibility. You know, Hillman kind of comes from a whole other direction. So it's just a difference in their sensibility. But yeah, Moore has done so much to help work so many of Hillman's brilliant insights into everyday life, and to help us look at that and identify that. And even I can go so far as to say, like, he has helped translate Hillman in some way. If you think about The Care of the Soul or A Blue Fire. So yeah. Yeah.
Last one, Marie Louise von Franz.
Ah, she's just the best. She's I have a colleague at Pacifica who's an Jungian analyst, and when he speaks her name, he puts his hand over her heart. And over the years, as I've continued to read her, I have come to really, I understand why he does that. I just think she was a tremendous genius in her own right.
Yeah.
I mean, just really, yeah.
You know how you have a few books that you dip into again and again and again? I have her book, I can't remember what it's called. I think it's Psychology and Alchemy. It's her book on alchemy.
Yeah, the green cover.
The green book.
Yeah,
yes.
right. Yeah.
I just find it such a beautiful book, and just so deep, perceptive. Just it's the type of book you can dip into and read a paragraph.
I know. Yes.
Get something.
Yes, I know. I know. I just, she amazes me. So yeah.
Well, Safron, let's move on to archetypal astrology. How did you get into that? And how did that?
Yeah, I had the very good fortune that my boss at the time at the archives, she had a ticket to go to an afternoon seminar with Rick Tarnas, who was in Santa Barbara doing a kind of small group teaching seminar, and she couldn't go. And so she offered me to go in her stead. And as I was listening to him, I realized that astrology was a living mythology that incorporated both myth and the psyche through the symbolism of astrology. And so all of the studies that I had done in myth and in depth psychology, like I just saw it in the way that Tarnas was talking about the planets and their configurations, and the way that that could be explored in terms of the collective, and then of course in terms of the individual experience. And it was just one of those moments, I'm sure you've had, where it just clicked and I saw it. I had a, yeah. And it basically changed the path of my work to a certain degree, because I then started to study that quite deeply. So it's become a part of my my research, my scholarship, but I also consult and I teach astrology. So but it's become a huge part of my work, but very much I differ a little bit from, Rick Tarnas's approach, or, other archetypal astrologers, in that I incorporate Jung. So like I move more toward the psychological dimension, but I also have a very strong incorporation of Hillman in my approach to astrology. So, just the ways that everyone kind of does it their own way.
Yes.
But yeah.
And this is my question, and I don't know whether it's a very good question, but as a layperson, with regards to astrology, I think of someone like Hillman, right? And I read Hillman, and he's taught me perhaps about different archetypal imaginations. Like I've learned a lot about Saturn through Hillman, the old
Right,
man, whatever,
right. Senex, yeah.
Xanax.
Mm.
Um, and you know, a lot about Dionysus maybe, and that archetypal imagination, and the puer, and the clash between the puer and the Sanics and all of that. And so, what I'm trying to get at, what my question is that, let's say there's the classical Greek pantheon, there's classical Greek myth, and then astrology seems to have a slightly different way of looking at archetypal imagination, or can you, it seems to me in a way what you're trying to do is marry them a little together, the classical Greek kind of pantheon and astrology. But for example, where does the puer, where do we find that in astrology, or Dionysus, or should
Yeah.
we even be looking for that? And are we just looking for, like, you know, from astrology, I can learn something about Neptune, which I'm not getting from.
Right. So so I think the main idea here is that the simple way that I would describe this is that archetypes are living forces within us, and astrology depicts those symbolically.
Yeah.
And, you know, the planets are obviously named after the Greco-Roman gods. And there are myths that we can readily identify Venus as Aphrodite, and the, you know, and the same thing, there are myths that you just scratch the surface of the 12 zodiac signs and all these myths come pouring out. But, you know, like any true symbol, it's not a fixed, it's not a sign. So I think, and what I mean by sign is a discrete, you know, pointing object. And in this, so what I'm trying to say is you can deepen into the signs and the planets and the relationships between planets into any myth, as is archetypally appropriate. You see what I'm saying? So for example, the puer as an archetypal figure is related to the quest for the spirit, isn't it? Right?
Yes.
And that in a chart could very well be described by the sun, someone's sun, maybe particularly if it's in a fire sign, but that could also belong to Jupiter as an astrological principle, which has so much to do about feeling touched and blessed and the drive toward that. The puer could be very much alive in the signs of Aries, Leo, or Sagittarius, and the way people are in search for the inspiration and drama of life when they have a strong fire signature. See, so you can take, so these archetypal
Like
figures.
flavors and styles and tastes and all of that.
Yes, it's so we, you know, when you learn the sort of basic language of astrology and you start to get a sense of the themes that belong to the signs or the planets, you can begin to widen, you know, your vision and see the figures that express that in distinct ways. Um, so it just, yeah, so but that's a vision of astrology as symbolizing the archetypal energies and patterns of life, and not all astrology is doing that. You know, so you know, just so that your listeners know, there are lots of different streams of astrology, from the high to the low brow to highbrow, and, you know, deep and more
Yeah.
superficial in pop culture. And so, you know, but it is, in my experience, when coming out of the depth tradition, meaning Jung's work, and wedding that with the way Tarnas has really drawn out and articulated some of these important ideas like synchronicity, and then bringing in the mythic imagination, which is so much part of Hillman's tradition, astrology can be an absolutely breathtaking, creative mythic activity that helps us relate to and imagine into the necessities and patterns and myths that we're living. And it helps us become more conscious. But you know, what I would also say is that it's to use a word that Hillman used in talking about astrology, it has an efficacious effect on the psyche or the soul, because it puts us in relationship to the myths. It puts us in relationship to the archetypal imagination. It moves us out of our personalistic, small, you know, sort of overly weaned sense of personal responsibility, both for our problems and for our gifts, and helps us begin to imagine in a much broader way what the psyche's demands on us are. In other words, the claims that the gods have made on us, and how do we respond to those claims. And astrology can help us work that in a very powerful way.
That's good. And Safron, I mean, just one other thing on that. Is I think you wrote a book with Kieran Legras. Can you just speak a little bit about Jung? Because obviously, if one reads the Red Book, there's a tremendous astrological influence in there, isn't there? And it's not something that everyone associates with Jung. His
right
of astrology. What do you think about it?
Right. So I approached Kieran years ago now with the idea that we would propose to do a Jung on astrology volume in the spirit of those other great volumes like Jung on alchemy, and you know, these wonderful volumes that scholars have put together, drawing Jung's writings on a particular topic so that it's a bit easier to find it. And Kieran agreed, which was great. And so that's what we did. We endeavored to gather the writings, paragraphs, ideas that sprinkled throughout the collected works and then the other major volumes of Jung's written works. He talked about astrology. And we did that because astrology has kind of been the like closet, the closet interest. I mean, alchemy is like, everyone's okay with Jung's sort of work on alchemy, but somehow the work on astrology, it still sort of seemed to carry a little bit of shame or something. I don't know. But
you ever keep it quiet? Like if you're at a party with extended family members and stuff like that, do you kind of, you know, keep quiet about astrology?
I mean, I not in any, no, I didn't mean to suggest that I am ashamed of being an astrologer, not at all. But I am always sensitive to you know, what people are open to. And I know that it's a very challenging, for some people, it's a very challenging notion, and I respect that. But if there's interest to talk about it, of course I'm open. I think the reason why Jung was careful and why the classical Jungian world was careful was because Jung was a scientist, and it was really important to establish analytical psychology as a proper field. And astrology has always, as Rick Tarnas has said, you know, astrology is the gold standard of superstition. And so it's, you know, one has to be mindful. But we edited that volume in order to contribute to moving past that. And we had, it was the total synchronicity. But sorry.
Nevertheless, Jung was steeped in astrology.
Right. And so as anyone that sort of goes into the book, he was studying astrology as early as 1911 because we have letters that he wrote to Freud talking about that. And at the same time that our book came out, the Jungian analyst and Jungian psychological astrologer Liz Green, who's an extraordinary scholar,
Yeah.
she published 2 books of hers were published at the same time.
Yeah.
One was Jung's own studies of astrology. And so she went through his library and pieced together the influences, who he was reading, when he was reading them, and all of that. So that was tremendous. And then she also published her own study on the astrological symbolism in Jung's Red Book. So it seemed like at the time was right for these works to come out and in a way change the discourse around astrology, coming out of these more sort of scholarly Tarnas, but also psychologically based, Jung, areas. So, yeah.
Cool. And Safron, in the little bit of time we've got left, I just wonder whether you could speak about perhaps this time that we're in whichever way you want, and as your webpage is called The Archetypal Eye, which I like, what does it mean to live with an archetypal eye at this time? So what's happening in the present time is the way you see it, and what does it mean to have an archetypal eye? 2 small questions just to finish off.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think to just state it very simply, is that in terms of our collective time, this era we're in, I mean, it really is marked by what feels like death and birth. And, this is really coming from listening to Rick Tarnas talk about how, when a child is being born, that in the birthing, there are these contractions that happen. And, that's part of the woman's body and her uterus. And, it's contracting and releasing, contracting and releasing. And there's this sense that, are we going to survive this? Am I going to, is the baby, the baby wonders if they're going to survive and pass through this constricted tunnel. And I'm just using this sort of analogy that I've heard Tarnas use because I just feel like it really captures something of the feeling level that no matter what country we live in, no matter what our cultural background and heritage is, that it does seem to me that as a humanity whole, we seem to be at the crosshairs of death and life. So I'll say that, and of course that means the promise of renewal, but that renewal, as we know, whether we're looking at myth or using the biological analogy of being born, there's a death that must precede the birth.
It's a big death and rebirth mystery.
Yes. Right. And it's painful, and very, very challenging. So, for people that are interested in an archetypal astrological perspective on that, I would just point them toward Rick Tarnas has some great YouTube videos, or they can, read, his book Cosmos and Psyche, where he gets into that. So, and then for me, like what an archetypal eye means, I mean, that phrase comes from Hillman, and it's a form of imaginative intelligence that sees through life to the mythic depths. that it's connected to the deeper archetypal reason at work at any time, both the difficult, the challenging, the wounding, and the grace-filled and the beautiful. And it's the archetypal eye just seeks to always be paying attention to that dimension and trying to, I mean, I think, you know, to me, you know, our work is to revere the gods with our conscious awareness. And that's what an archetypal eye is attuned to.
We are enmeshed in the gods, or as Hillman said, entangled in the gods, or something to that effect.
Right. That's right.
Okay. Well, maybe that's a good place to leave it, Safron.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for and especially since we were cut off last time, midstream, mid Odyssey, and and
That's
thanks.
good.
Thanks very much. And I just wanted to say, I was watching something last night, a talk by Dennis Slattery.
Yeah.
And I'd never really come across him before, but I enjoyed it, you know.
Yeah.
And one thing he said, which I thought was really great, is he was saying, it's like the truth's up for grab at this time. So he was talking about this time. It's like no one quite knows what to believe in anymore, you know, which I think maybe fits in with all of what you were just saying. But it's like, it's so up in the air, and so that's that kind of death rebirth maybe as well.
Right.
But I like that. But I just wanted to say that, you know, the work you do over there at Pacifica it's great, and it's a pity that there's not a Pacifica Graduate Institute in Australia. So if you're looking to expand in the near future, because when I did psychology at the University of Western Australia, it was Skinner, rats, stats, and all of that kind of stuff. So
Well, you'll have to talk to Glenn about that because that was his experience in Sydney. And so he'll have a lot to say with you about that.
have love and his dog. So it's like, it's a pity there's not an institute looking at things archetypally and through the depth dimension and all of that.
Well, maybe, you know, with work like you're doing with your podcast and getting around Australia, maybe it'll seed something. We don't know. We can hope.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.